So next, I want to take a look at two sites in Anatolia that kind of point to the inclusion of certain parts of Nissen's interaction sphere and Stein's horizon style to show how local communities had adopted and adapted the Ubaid material tradition. Now, I want to start with Kanan Tepe. And this is a relatively small Ubaid occupation, about a half a hectare, maybe a population of 100 people, living on the banks of the Tigris River in modern southeastern Turkey. Um, Archaeological excavations recovered numerous structures, but most of those were storage facilities like what you see here, these cell plan storage bins. To date, excavations only revealed one domestic structure, and it's presumably built on a tripartite plan, although the third of the complex over here remained unexcavated in the bulks of one of the trenches. But this house is really kind of fascinating because the large tripartite house here was burned in a fire. The roof collapsed in on itself, leaving all of the finds in situ. And so I got the privilege of excavating the site, and it's really even today the highlight of my archaeological career. But we can see inside of the house large quantities of charred seeds. The house burnt down in late summer, right after after the wheat harvest. So we can kind of see this in terms of the massive storage and processing of grain that's occurring here. We also see stone tools, lots of obsidian that's being brought in pre-finished. It's not being worked at the site, but also local lithics of a lesser quality. A series of grinding stone axes that were likely used to polish objects within the household, and particularly lapidary and beadworking. Pottery, over 50 spindle whorls and several grinding stones were recovered. So we can see a broad picture of domestic life. The location of these finds within the objects also suggests that many of them were stored on the roof when it collapsed first and were down on the floor, and then there were shelves on the walls where objects were being stored that then collapsed on top of the roof. So archaeologically, when we were excavating this, it took quite a bit to kind of sort out those details. But we do appear to have kind of multiple levels of occupation inside of the house, on the roof, and then storage and shelving built into and wooden shelves built into the walls of the compound. Now, the cooking installations were absent inside of the house, so there was a small hearth, but it doesn't appear that anybody's cooking food inside of the house, which is kind of interesting, but a development we see at quite a few Ubaid sites. One of the small rooms of the house, this one here, was filled with chaff and dung, and this is likely for fuel storage. We can kind of see large chaff cakes, dung cakes, that are being pressed and processed. And that's because trees are relatively scarce and needed for other means, so you use animal dung as a fuel. And we still see this being done in this region of southeastern Turkey today. Associated with the house itself was a series of reed-lined cellular storage bins that were filled with surplus cereals. Most of those had been emptied, likely because they were processing the new grain to put back in them. And then here in the exterior courtyard, there were two fire installations. One you can see down here, and then one up here, that were probably used to cook the daily meals if they were cooking food at all. They may have been eating kind of cold porridges or stews and roasting meat over open fires, but something like that. But they were also being used to smelt copper, as this facility contained a few small pieces of copper and some copper slag. So we know that its location is near those Ergani mines would have brought raw copper into the settlement. The other thing that I find really fascinating is that on the roof of the house, right, in what we call Ubaid structure 4, there were 6 large straight ledge rim jars. And inside of those jars, we see lots of abrasion that is characteristic of fermentation. And around those 6 jars were a series of reed baskets and a reed mat that contained wheat and barley. And on the mat itself, as you can kind of see the remains here, we found malted barley, that is germinated barley seeds, to increase the sugar content of the fermentation. So taken all together, these large storage jars, so you can kind of see the rim of one here, would have been able to produce about 200 liters of beer if it was used simultaneously. So we're talking here about 50 gallons. So when we start to look at this, we have to kind of ask ourselves, what is being done here that this much beer is needing to be produced. And I think that's an important aspect that kind of when we reflect back on what we've already talked about with proto-dynastic Egypt or other sites of as the importance of beer bringing people together to perform these kind of community tasks. And I think the harvest itself is one of those great ideas where you're going to need much more labor than is available to bring in all the wheat and barley in time before it spoils in the field. Um, so at Canan Tepe, we can kind of see this means of local populations to households themselves being able to mobilize labor through the use of beer that may have provided a scalable alternative for the ways in which people mobilize labor to build large scale structures like those at the temple at Eridu. The other side I want to talk about in Anatolia is Deir and Tepe. This is a small community in the Malatya Plain in the upper Euphrates, and excavations here were constructed in advance of the Ataturk Dam, and we see a relatively simple, large scale horizontal excavation that found the remains of 14 building complexes dating to the Ubaid period. 10 of those are tripartite buildings, and 4 of those had multi-room complexes that were likely storage facilities. So inside each house, we see a similar type of rich artifact assemblage that we saw at Canan Tepe: pottery and stone tools, spindle whorls and portable ovens, grinding stones, bead production, stamp seals and sealings. All of this points to the general overall domestic activity at the site. However, there are also 2 large buildings that were associated with extensive furnaces that contained a large amount of copper slag, suggesting there's a relatively large amount of copper ore being produced and made into raw copper at the site. And so the location of copper here led Oates to call this an Ubaid colony for the production of copper objects that were important in rituals in southern Mesopotamia. But there are some really kind of characteristic ideas about the settlement itself, right, that kind of point to a local style. Unlike sites in southern Mesopotamia, the architecture here is agglutinated. That means it shares common walls, much like the settlement we talked about earlier at Çatalhöyük. Tripartite structures in Mesopotamia are generally freestanding, but this agglutinated architecture dates all the way back to the early pre-pottery Neolithic here. The other thing that's really important to kind of think about is that Bakir Gerdel's analysis here suggests that the extended family household was the locus of food production and craft activity, but it was also the focus of ritual activities within the household. And he, quote, calls it the center of daily life, developed by coexistent relationships of the domestic, social, economic, and religious activity, end quote. So we can kind of see Gerdel's idea here is one that mirrors what Wengro is talking about for sites like Tepe Garwa, that the temple and the household are largely synonymous, and that religious activity is occurring within these central rooms at the same time that the domestic and productive activities of the family are occurring.